Probably the most high-profile media event of the past year in Russia was the release of the series Slovo Patsana, dedicated to the lives of youth gangs in the late 1980s. Judging by the number of search engine queries, it sparked much more interest among Russians than the criminal war in Ukraine, the upcoming re-election of Putin, or the mobilization. For young people, the events shown in the series are something wildly exotic from another era, but older people easily recognize the types of characters on the screen. Back in the day, such characters literally terrorized the streets of post-Soviet cities and were simply called Gopniks. In the 90s and the 2000s, Gopniks were an almost universal phenomenon, causing a lot of trouble for ordinary citizens. After all, they could be anywhere. In the courtyard of a new building, on an unfamiliar street, or just at a bus stop, you could run into guys with a distinctive look and hear the classic line, "Hey, you're not from around here? Which neighborhood are you from? Got any money? What if I find some?" And such an encounter promised nothing good, because an ordinary person risked not only the contents of their wallet, but also their own health. So in this episode we continue. We'll talk about when Gopniks appeared, where their name came from, how they lived, and what rules they followed. And finally, you'll find out why the era of the Gopniks came to an end and where you can still encounter them. My name is Semyon and I declare the How Did They Live segment open. Let's begin. A few general remarks. Gopniks, or Gops, are representatives of a marginal youth subculture characterized by aggressiveness, lack of education, low social status, utter intolerance, and a marked disregard for ethical norms and generally accepted moral principles. As a rule, Gopniks come from the outskirts of industrial cities. Most often they come from poor, disadvantaged families. That is why Gopniks like to assert themselves by mocking or committing violence against people of a higher social status than themselves. Gopniks are the real infantry of the criminal world. They take things and money from citizens, commit petty fraud, and steal. But their favorite activity is beating up passers-by right on the streets. It should be noted that not all Gopniks break the law, but most of their actions fall under articles of the criminal code. At the very least, it's petty hooliganism, and sometimes even more serious crimes like extortion, robbery, and mugging. Gopniks reject commonly accepted moral values such as loyalty, honesty, politeness, and compassion. Instead of all that, they have their own code of honor based on underworld rules. Interestingly, Gopniks can't stand representatives of other subcultures such as bikers, hippies, goths, and rappers. By the way, Gopniks themselves never call themselves that. Moreover, they consider this word insulting when used about themselves. Instead, they use names like guys, patsanchiki, or rebyatosiki. Anatomy of a Gopnik. Anatomy. Now, a few words about the appearance of Gopniks, because this topic definitely deserves attention. Their style is a fantastic mix of bad taste, a hidden threat to those around them, and the flashy chic typical of all fringe types. Even the way Gopniks walk is different from normal people. They move with a swagger, using a wrestler's swaying gait. Gopniks also love to squat. It's a habit that comes from prisons or places associated with them. They also have a common habit of cracking sunflower seeds and spitting the shells onto the sidewalk. The main attribute of any self-respecting Gopnik, of course, is the flat cap. These are often worn by rural workers or guests from the southern republics. In winter, a real Gopnik protects his head with a knitted hat. As for clothing, it's the cheapest Chinese windbreaker, usually with lots of inscriptions and strange labels. The timeless classic, of course, is a black leather jacket and sweatpants, which are very comfortable for squatting. In the 90s, pointy shoes were especially popular among Gopniks. Now, besides those, sneakers are also in fashion. And the last accessory to complete the look is prayer beads, which a real guy skillfully spins in his hand. Where did Gopniks come from? Gopniks have always existed in Russia due to the peculiarities of the culture, mentality, and the prison customs that prevailed in this region. They just weren't called that. There are several theories about the name. As early as the mid-19th century, there was the verb gopat, which meant to wander or to beg. Well, they say going from wandering to petty crime is just a small step. According to another version, the term Gopnik appeared in Russia at the end of the 19th century, and not somewhere in a dark province, but in the very capital of the country, St. Petersburg. Here, in the building of the modern Oktyabrskaya Hotel, the City Shelter Society, or GOP for short, was located for a long time. It was engaged in the re-education of homeless children who committed petty theft and robberies on the city streets. Troubled teenagers were caught and brought to this very GOP, where they tried to set them on the right path. Obviously, it didn't work out very well. The young offenders continued their usual way of life, now bothering the residents of the city center. Over time, they started to be called Gopniks, after the name of the organization where they lived. After the revolution in this country, the new government continued the practice by abolishing the City Shelter Society and creating instead state dormitories for the proletariat, which, ironically, were abbreviated in a way familiar to the city's residents. The new office also dealt with homeless children, but now they didn't really bother with re-educating them, believing that under the people's government, everything would work itself out. To make things even more lively for the local residents, adults from the provinces who came to Petersburg to earn money, as well as the city's homeless and beggars, were also settled in the GOP. In the mid-1920s, about 400 people lived here, with an average age of no more than 24 years. It's clear that such a mix of marginalized people led to a sharp deterioration in the crime situation in the surrounding areas. The GOP hotel turned into a real gangster ghetto, which the locals tried to avoid at all costs. But that didn't always help. In August 1926, the guests of the GOP ambushed a young worker from the button factory on Ligovsky Avenue. Dragging the girl into a nearby gateway, they beat and raped her. However, even that wasn't enough for those scoundrels. They started offering the victim to anyone interested for 15-20 kopecks. Later, the victim said that no fewer than 30 to 40 people abused her. The police quickly apprehended the rapists. 7 of them were executed, and the rest received lengthy prison sentences. This outrageous case shocked Soviet society so much that the GOP was quickly shut down, and its residents were either imprisoned or dispersed. The term Gopnik entered popular use and remains today. Throughout the entire Soviet period, the problem of street crime was very acute. The situation was especially difficult in large industrial centers and in regions with many former convicts. By the 1970s, law enforcement managed to restore relative order. But even after that, fights between neighborhoods were a common thing in large cities of the USSR. Gopniks started making a comeback in the late 1980s during Perestroika. The Gopniks of the Perestroika period inherited from their GOP predecessors a passion for petty crimes, especially street robbery and mugging. Another distinctive feature of the real guys of that time was their fierce hatred towards all kinds of alternative kids, hippies, punks, and rockers. Gopniks in the 1990s. It was the golden age for Gopniks. Along with racketeers and the New Russians, they became a true symbol of that era. At that time, the post-Soviet countries were literally swept by a wave of organized crime. Gang fights were happening right on the streets. Criminal bosses and thieves-in-law were dividing spheres of influence, and their numerous henchmen were terrorizing private entrepreneurs. Those were fun times. In those turbulent times, law enforcement simply didn't have the strength or resources to properly fight street crime. The rise of the Gopnik subculture was also fueled by social and economic reasons. People were left without money or worked for pennies, which led to widespread marginalization, the spread of alcoholism, and drug addiction. As a result, while you were working several jobs or drowning your sorrows in vodka, children were left to themselves, and the streets took care of their upbringing. There is another reason for the growth of Gopnik movements in the 90s. This was a time of the glamorization of criminal life, which spread through TV, books, and newspaper articles. Young people were the quickest and most eager to adopt the life philosophy, rules, and worldview of criminals, gladly using thieves' laws as a guide for life. For example, it was during this time that squatting became fashionable among street youth. This old prison habit had a practical purpose. The routine in places of detention forbids sitting or lying down before lights out, and among inmates, sitting on the floor is considered degrading. In the 1990s, a large amount of criminal slang entered the vocabulary of Gopniks, which hadn't been seen before. At the same time, the concepts of fair fights disappeared, like not hitting someone who's down, stopping at first blood, or not hitting below the belt, rules that Soviet neighborhood toughs used to try to follow. Now everything became much harsher and bloodier. The 2000s, the decline of the Gopnik era. By the end of the 1990s, Gopnik culture had become an almost universal phenomenon in post-Soviet countries. However, already in the next decade, the decline of this criminal subculture began. Several factors contributed to this. Law enforcement agencies finally started doing their job, thanks to which the most ruthless Gopniks were quickly sent behind bars. Of course, street gangs still remained. Their members continued to hang out in courtyards and entrances, started fights, and harassed passers-by. But now they were afraid to commit more serious crimes like robbery and muggings. Some researchers believe that the decline of the Gopnik era was caused by the widespread adoption of and hard drugs. Because of them, a significant number of real guys passed away prematurely. Another part was ruined by vodka. Well, those who were lucky enough to survive settled down and started families. The new generation that replaced the guys from the 90s simply didn't want to follow in their footsteps. And there were good reasons for that as well. In the early 2000s, economic growth began in the post-Soviet space. More or less, the factories started working again, and problems with salary payments became a thing of the past. The number of marginalized people began to decrease sharply, which immediately affected the social base of the Gopniks. Along with the rise in prosperity, the trend for a criminal lifestyle, which had attracted children in the 1990s, gradually faded away in society. Gang showdowns in the streets now seem like a nightmare. Teenagers of the 2000s. This is the best path to upward mobility. The glamour of criminal life is a thing of the past. Other values and hobbies took its place, like computer games and later the internet. And the arrival of Western cultural values made many people from the post-Soviet space hate the dumb, brutish aesthetics of Gopniks. Gopniks still exist today. You can find them in residential districts and on the outskirts of industrial centers. These are pathetic echoes of the chaos that raged in the streets a quarter of a century ago. Even the famous building in St. Petersburg on Ligovsky Prospect, the original cradle of the Gopniks, is now just an ordinary three-star hotel. A few words in conclusion. I guess it's worth adding a short afterword at the end. There are regions in Russia where the 90s seem like they never ended and aren't going to end anytime soon. There, among the male population, more than half have done time, and the Gopnik subculture is still alive and well. Moreover, the local population is trying to creatively build on the legacy of the wild 90s. I'm talking about the youth criminal subculture AUE, which promotes the value system and behavioral norms of Russian organized crime. This movement has many supporters in the Russian Federation, especially in the Siberian regions and the Far East. It gets to the point where school kids and vocational school students collect money for the Thieves' Fund, form gangs, and organize mass riots. And even though this movement has been designated extremist, it doesn't really stop its spread. However, there is a lot of fake and pretentious stuff in the activities of AUE. Professional criminals treat members of this movement with disdain. How can we not recall Karl Marx's saying that history repeats itself twice? The first time as tragedy and the second as farce. See you in the next episode.